shout-outs, which is about 5 to 10 minutes where people can come up and talk about their own product. So if you are a founder, CPO, or just working on something interesting, I want you to feel encouraged to just come forward, take the stage at the end, and talk about what excites you. Yeah? I'll just let Chad have the word now.
All right. Thanks. All right, thanks everybody. I have a pretty loud voice anyway, so we'll see how this goes, but cool. So I want to start with a myth, actually, or a story that my head of analytics, Bav, told me one day. And he was talking about World War II. So in World War II, only about 50% of the planes that went out came back and survived. Right? And so that's an amazing number, like life or death number, right? So the military said, hey, we have to fix this. We have to do some research here, right? We have to identify how can we make these planes, more planes come back and hit this metric, right? So they did tons of research, right? They started looking at planes and they saw a pattern come up, right? So the bullets were coming in the same place over and over again. They were coming in the tail gunner, the center, and the wings. The tail gunner, the center, and the wings, over and over again. So this great, great insight, right? And they said, hey, where are we going to put the armor? Because you can't put the armor everywhere. It makes the planes too heavy, right? So you have to pick and choose. So it's like, hey, we have this insight. We know where we need to put the armor, into the tail and the center and the wings. Thankfully, there was a group of statisticians on the team as well, and they said, hang on, you're actually missing a huge chunk of data, right? You're looking at the wrong data. You're looking only at the data on the planes that survived. What about all the planes that didn't come back, right? That's the data you need. Actually, what these bullets represent are where the planes can take damage, right? So where you need to put the armor is actually where the bullets are not, right? And this gets at a sense of it was a big breakthrough for the war, right? It saved probably thousands of lives, but looking at data in a unique way. And this is an example of what we call survivorship bias, right? So this means concentrating on the people or things that made it past some point in the process and overlooking those that did not. Now, we obviously live in a data-driven world, right? Like for product management and design, it's like, hey, if there's a job description and we want a data-driven product manager, we're a data-driven company. Data is key to our decision-making. It's also highly biased, right? I think it's worth understanding that for all of us. And most critically, maybe it's taking our focus away of where really big growth is. That's not necessarily represented in our dashboards or metrics. So there's some obvious reasons why we don't invest more in why we invest too much in the wrong data, right? But I want to talk through a couple here, right? Of how does survivorship bias, it's a little slow coming out. There we go. How does survivorship bias kind of live in our world, right? So I think most people are familiar with bounce rate, right? So the people come to your site, they see a page, they throw up, and they leave, right? So 45% is a pretty good kind of average, right? That means 55% people thrive. If you look at mobile, it goes around 65%. The people that show up in our, or 45% show up in our data. If we think about app use, right, a number that's thrown around is only about 25% of people will use an app more than once. That means 75% download it, use it once, and go away. They aren't showing up in any of our event data, right? But a lot of our time is focused on that 25%. If you're familiar with Net Promoter Score, this is a really good, a lot of companies use this as a representation of quality of your product, right? And we actually use this a lot at MOO to understand what's going on with our products that are delivered. Of course, NPS, if you take in the survey, you take the number of people came in, the number of people converted, the 40% who opted in. You send an email and get about a 15% response rate and 25% Net Promoter Score, and you get a set of data within that that can be super valuable, right? But it doesn't represent of those, it's only representative of those survivors. And in e-commerce, which of course is my world, actually, you know, an amazing conversion rate is about 9 or 10%, but the average overall is around 3%, meaning visitor to purchase coming into a website on a daily basis. And if you look at mobile, that goes down to 1.5% of survivors, right? That's there. And of course, certainly this is enough data to be statistically significant, especially at big companies that have lots and lots of data coming in. But what about the 98.5% or 97% or even 90% or 80% that don't convert? Right? We're often blind to why non-customers fail. Right? Yet breakthrough products can come from understanding the potential customers who never show up in our dashboards or metrics. And if you think about where we invest most of our time, right, I bet most places in here, and including in MOO, 85, 90%, 95%, or even 98% or 100% is devoted at BI and data warehouse and the huge analytics teams that's looking at the 3% of data, right? This is where we invest most of our time, is on these survivors. Sorry, it's a little slow. So why do we tend to invest so much? Some of these are easy questions, or easy questions to answer. Right? It's expensive, right? It's expensive, it's time consuming, it's risky, it's pretty resource intensive. It's inconvenient, right? Like in the morning I can go and I can pull down some data and have it in a PowerPoint document for a meeting the next day, right? And also customers are just easier, right? The same thing for a survey, right? If I want to run a survey, I can pull an opt-in list of email addresses, have a survey out, potentially have information within days or weeks. Trying to get it non-customer days is going to be a lot more expensive. We also tend to be a business case-driven culture, right? A lot of our executives come from data-driven backgrounds. There's finance, there's operations, there's marketing. They want the cold, hard facts and the numbers to help us make decisions. That's a lot harder to get from non-customers than customers. So we tend to focus on that small percentage. There's also some biases inherent in what we do that I want to talk through a little bit. So in some ways, we do look at the data which we could easily collect, not the data we need, right? So we have GA, we have Tableau, we have the data warehouse. We have actually more data than we can probably even process much of the time. And we tend to assume that the data we have can actually answer all our questions, right? If conversion is up or conversion's down, we think we can find the data and look in the right place and there's an answer laying somewhere if we just look hard enough, sometimes months and months and months to find that information. But the answer may not be there, right? So at MOO, every now and then we ask this question, and it's a hard question we haven't quite figured out, is how often do we create new KPIs? And it's not very often, right? For example, if we identify a customer segment, say at MOO, designers are really important, it's actually kind of hard to get into our data and figure out exactly who a designer is. And therefore we say, well, we need to measure it, and it'll go on a KPI deck to say TBD, right? And that'll go on for a couple months, and then it'll eventually get pulled out because we actually can't get at that data. And I think this happens again, right? And it happens over and over again, where it's harder to create new KPIs because it's much easier to get the data we collect, not necessarily the data we need. So it's also data's really, really loud. So Clayton Christensen, who you may know from Innovator's Dilemma, talks a lot about this. And I think back to an example of when, so we founded a company called Blur back in 2005. It's a self-publishing kind of photo book company. And of course, when you're starting a new product or a new company, you have everyone's a non-customer, right? Like you're out there in the world, you're out there in a really context-rich situation because you're observing customers, you're meeting with the potential customers. It's rich, you're getting information, you're observing that, right? We're figuring out the problem, we're figuring out the people. But then the company starts to grow, right? And a year in or a year and a half in, the data starts coming in and we start to fall into that trap of the crisp, clean precision of a spreadsheet, right? That false precision can sometimes be mistaken for reality. And it's fun, it's human, it's really human to look at the clean data, right? But it's also really, really loud data, right? Like it comes in every morning as a KPI report, it's on Slack every day, there's PowerPoint documents, there's tons of meetings every week, and this really, really loud data. And in that loud environment, the quiet data, that context-rich data, right? It's really hard to move that above the really loud data that we work with on a day-to-day basis. So we model, right? And we model what we can, and we tend to model what we know. Business cases tend to illustrate growth based on historical metrics. So for example, I think you've probably all been in this scenario, but we're just going through MOO again, right? So we, of course, launched lots of physical products. We're known for business cards. We also have postcards and flyers and stickers and all these things around brand identity that people use. If we're looking to grow revenue and have high confidence in revenue, adding something to our existing lines, right, is very high confidence, right? Hey, adding a new size, adding a new paper, adding a new feature, our BI and finance team can look back and say, hey, we have around 10 years of data or 5 years of data. When we added this 3 or 4 years ago, at this point, it increased the curve like this. Therefore, going into 2018, we know we can count on a couple $100K of revenue from this high confidence incremental add over here. So that's one business case, right? On the other side, you potentially have entirely new markets, right? Or something like even packaging, branded merchandise, something we actually have no historical data on. And you have to do a lot more work to get that. It's market research. We probably don't have the money to do the surveys we kind of need to really understand the market to get there. This is a little more white space, potentially a much bigger opportunity in the future. But when you're going into 28 planning and you have this one against the high confidence one based on historical data, you can kind of know the one that usually wins, right, in that conversation. You're thinking about growth. And the data can be trusted, right? It really can be. But again, it's limited to the data we have. So it's going to always be incremental growth and really limit our ability to do non-customer growth. So we have so many facts at our fingertip, right? And it's easy to confuse information with evidence sometimes when we really want to do is measure outcomes, right? So I worked with many BI team over the years, and the goal is there's always never enough BI people really to support the needs coming in, especially from product, right? And there's a goal to, hey, we should enable self-service, right? But really what we enable usually is self-service of facts, right? Like, here's conversion rate, here's sessions, here's the number of users, here where they got, here's abandonment rate. They aren't necessarily getting at insights, because insights are actually hard, right? The number of Twitter followers a person has isn't really a measure of influence, right? Just because you measure it doesn't necessarily mean it's correct or not. LinkedIn, are they modeling, hey, the number of insights I have for number of connections I have, or how do I get, how long I held my job, or how happy was my job? These are outcomes that are really hard to measure. And I think sometimes we find ourselves really overwhelmed with facts and not necessarily insights. Because true insights really synthesize several facts together within the context of the business to drive decision making. So you may be familiar with picture, this idea of CAL paths or design paths. So if you look on this image here, you'll see the streets and the sidewalks where the architects created space, right, of where they thought people were going to go. And then you see all these diagonal lines of actually where people walk, right? And it's just a representative of the same thing happens in our data, right? That at some point, some person, right, made a decision of what data to collect, what not to collect, what to call it, how to present that. It may have been years ago, and we seldom sometimes question that. But our entire worlds are defined by it. So at MOO, for example, we have two business units. We have one we call SOHO, which is small office, home office, which is kind of what MOO is built on, right? These are 1-, 2-person businesses, kind of up to 9 employees. And then the other hand, we have MOO Business Services, which is more a managed service for larger businesses. The cutoff point, really, at someone said, hey, if you have 10 employees, you go into this business unit. If you have 9 or under, you go into this business unit. All our data is structured this way. We now have 100 million pounds in revenue, all structured around these business units. And as we start to identify new horizontal customers and jobs to be done that move across that, it's really, really, really hard to actually form the data outside of that structure that's kind of been handed out, that was made kind of as a pulled out of the air 5 or 6 years ago. It defines really how our data is collected. And so it's important to remember this as we look at not only our website, but also how we organize our data. We also tend to fall into the delusion of the single explanation, right? To say, hey, and this is great for us, hey, we launched this feature and conversion went up, therefore that correlation is strong, and this is good stories to have, right? But we also know that people are complex, and decision making is complex and messy, right? And this is the world we live with. I think if we take something as simple as like booking a flight, right? Deciding on a flight, where to go on holiday, and if you think to yourself all the decisions and variables that go into that small decision of where we're going, who am I going with, what's the time of year, when does school get out, gosh, everyone's gonna be flying at the same time, can I get a discount? All those decisions and all those interactions with other people seldom will show up in BA or Norwegian Air's abandonment rate of their cart. And finally, I think something that I imagine is preaching to the choir here, of the important role of qualitative data. But I think somehow in our quest for confidence, right, qualitative knowledge ended up being positioned as the opposite of quantitative knowledge. So Indy Young, whose background user experience, said, we've all heard the word fluffy associated with qualitative knowledge. If quant research is seen as producing reliable and convertible facts, then qualitative research is seen as the opposite, the soft, made-up, inapplicable knowledge. I think we hopefully here know this isn't true, right? The qualitative work answers the why, right? And things like web metrics are really shitty at intent, right? So if you take a terrible web metric like time on site or time on page, it gets thrown around every now and then. Of course, some people will say, hey, people are super engaged with their content. They're reading it through. Yeah, but you also don't know if maybe they're lost. Maybe they're having a hard time. Maybe they're over in another tab watching, kitten videos on YouTube. Right? That intent only comes from, getting and talking with people. Right? Quant is better is really deeply embedded in our culture, right? And this does limit us, again, when we get to start talking about non-customers and that insight. So if we agree or disagree with these points, but I think we can agree that a good chunk of potential growth is not captured in our data-driven approach to product necessarily. So what are some tactics we can use to get at this? And this is really just some ideas to throw out. I've tried a couple of these over the years. Some have worked, some haven't. It's actually really hard to get there, right, in many, many ways. And some are pretty blunt, actually, meaning it's expensive, right? This is a lot of times why we don't do this, right? It's true, we have to make sure that we represent non-customers in our research, right? So if you take something like a survey, right, a product survey, we want to send it out. It's really, really easy to send it to customers, right? If you want to do a non-customer survey and buy a panel, say in the US, of US customers within a certain demographic and range, that's 10K, 20K, potentially 30K to add that to your data set, right? And so I just say this because I think in some ways there's lots of guerrilla techniques you can use, and we'll talk about a little bit more. But in some ways, as you're getting into 2018 planning and trying to do your budgeting around, hey, we want to really grow, if we're just focusing on this data, it's going to limit our growth to sequential things. If we want big data, we need to figure out how can we invest and actually invest in understanding customers and their needs in a new way. You can also go ask people that have money. Whether these are frenemies or friends in marketing. Marketing tends to have big budgets compared sometimes to product development or user research, right? But they also tend to, in my experience, actually they're talking out to non-customers in different ways, even if they aren't asking the right questions, right? So, for example, at MOO, I started about 2.5 years ago. There's a really lack of non-customer understanding, non-customer research, which is kind of accepted, right? That's how it happened. But I started looking at marketing, and we actually send out something called a brand tracker. Because actually MOO spends millions and millions of dollars every year on awareness and advertising and pieces like that. So how do we measure that? This brand tracker survey. This big survey goes out to both customers as well as non-customers to see how is our advertising working, right? Or can people recall MOO's brand? As you start digging into this, you start to say, hey, there's actually some interesting questions here, and demographic information you start to compare and contrast, right? So one thing that came out of this, and this is kind of representative here, but in general, this is a bit of a breakdown of how MOO customers look, right? So we have lots of single person, 1 or 2 person companies. This is really how we're built. These are people coming out, starting their own business, freelance designers, small businesses, and we've grown really big on that, and made it easy for people to design things that could never do it before, right? On the other side then, around 10 plus, we have MOO Business Services, which is a more managed service, and we continue to grow that. As you start looking and comparing this then to just demographics of number of employees that came from that brand tracker, you start to see something like this, right? So one, we're way over indexed here, which was kind of what we thought would happen. But you also see we're way under indexed, kind of in this middle realm here of like 5 to 9 employees. And as we dug in deeper into that, it showed actually our NPS kind of went off the cliff a little bit as we got to this stage. And as we started talking to them, we see actually these people don't find a home, right? We aren't building the features for them, the opportunities for them, because they were falling between where we kind of said our data should be, right? And this really insight was maybe known there, but really came out in a big way by looking at the non-customer research and comparing it, right? And since then, we call this the gap, right? We've started to build more products and started to serve this in much, much better, and have actually seen lots of growth coming from this realm here. But really, that only came from comparing and contrasting that information. And marketing, even if they are sending out surveys, sometimes you can, what we've tried to do is you can start sticking a couple questions in there, right? And they also tend to be the people that understand inherently that non-customers are where they need to start, sometimes even more than engineers or product managers or other parts of the organization. The other way to start is potentially just pick a specific segment and dive in deep on it, right, to really understand them if it's a big, big problem. So some of you may be familiar with Blue Ocean Strategies. The book is a couple years ago. It's kind of a book on innovation and different ways of approaching. Red markets would be one there's highly competitive. Blue oceans would be areas there's tons of opportunity. I'm sure there's entire TED Talks about this subject, and I won't go into it in much detail. But it is worth thinking about, especially soon to be non-customers. right? And soon-to-be non-customers are people that are actually, they're in your market, right? They're kind of using it minimally. They may be looking for some other opportunity, right? And here's kind of the bulleted slide you'll get that talks about that, right? So they're really just on the edge of kind of leaving your industry. So this isn't just leaving your company. So for MOO, this would be someone that's in print, printing or print-on-demand printing, or using print as part of their marketing and collateral, right? So one of the examples that pop up here is Pret. Pret looked at the market and said, hey, there's fast food, right? And then there's actually, traditionally it says British people would go out and kind of sit down for lunch, or in Europe, sit down for lunch, have a nice lunch. But there was this in-between space where people were ready to leave the restaurant business, right, and go out for lunch, but they aren't quite ready for just the sit-down fast food as you get kind of in the States. And so Pret said, here's an opportunity for actually healthy kind of takeaway food, and filled it by looking at potential people who are going to leave the restaurants. Right? There's refusing non-customers, so these are basically people who have seen your offering as an option to fulfill their needs, but aren't participating. So video games is a good example of this, right? So, grandparents, my wife, different people, they're looking for ways to spend time, right? Whether it's watching TV or something. Video games has always been an opportunity for that, right? But when you look at hardcore gaming or shooting, it's not for me, right? Of course, then the Wii comes along, or even something like Candy Crush, and fills this hole by targeting people who had said, no, I'm not a video game player, and opening up an entirely new market to that area. And then unexplored, which we won't talk about much, but there's the example of that is someone really not even considered part of your market. And the example that gets shown there is around teeth whitening strips. So back in the past, teeth whitening was something you went to a dentist for, right? And you paid a couple $100, if not more, to get your teeth whitened. It wasn't thought of something that could be offered outside of that. As I looked at the market and said, actually, you know what? We can do that, and we can do that at Boots, right? And all of a sudden, you're offering something that used to be unavailable to many people because it cost too much into an entirely new market, and it grew from that area. So at MOO, is very specific because, of course, we've built ourselves around, really, and you probably know this from business cards, right? That's how we grow quite strongly, and we need to think about how do we enter new markets to grow outside of that. An example of this. So about a week ago, or a week and a half ago, I spoke at the JAM conference, which is a product management conference here in London. Mark, who's on my team, went. He got this great email about a week to go. And if you scroll down, it has, find out who's attending, easily connect with people on that day, and this popped out here. So that's a good example of a soon-to-be non-customer, right? So obviously I think many people in here would say, I don't need business cards anymore, right? I have LinkedIn, I have apps and these kind of things. So understanding that need of people who are kind of potentially in our market, potentially using it, but just ready to move on to the next thing is of key importance to MOO. And we actually know that in some ways, even a business card isn't necessarily used for how we think it is. It's not necessarily used for information. It's used to stand out. There's a job to be done there. But for MOO to survive, we need to move into other spaces and understand where are these people going and how do we either get in front of them or help serve their needs in a different way. But of course, the person who thinks business cards suck isn't going to show up in our web funnel, right? They're never going to make it a website. They're not searching for it. But it's important for us to get there. From a tactical point of view, and I think this gets at once people get to your website and the 90% of people who don't convert, there are, of course, web and mobile intercepts. This is the somewhat annoying things you see on websites, right, that pop up a bail pop or pop up a little overlay and say, hey, would you like to give us some feedback? There's many that do this. One example we've used in the past, and I used previously called Ethnio. So what Ethnio does, Ethnio has various packages, but how we would use it is just real-time recruiting while people are on your site. So basically, it would bring up this little thing here that says, a penny for your thoughts, sure, why not? You fill out a really quick form of who you are, have you been here before, to try to get your demographics and whether you're, that comes in real time. And actually, you're sitting there in the conference room seeing these coming in, and then you call them, right? And then they screen share, and you actually get people who are still on your website, right? And they'll share your screen, right? And you actually get to see them running through your website. And again, since 90% of them are going to fail, you start to get some real insights of watching people go through that process and seeing where they pop out that other end. It takes a little bit of logistics to set up, but in the end of the day, it can be a really affordable way to try to get at some real insights that you won't necessarily get from bringing people into a lab, right? So these are people actually coming to your site, getting into that. Of course, usertesting.com is another one that's quite easy to use. It's a bit different though because that's based on panels and sometimes hard to get the right person. But again, it's getting to be your site and watching them and recording their path through to get at those people who abandon. The other thing is about, okay, how if you get people if we get people talking about non-customers, that's maybe the biggest hurdle, right? Like I think you'll get a lot of people to agree, but when you ask for money, they'll say, we'll get to it next year. Or ask for time, we'll get to it. I think especially at larger companies tend to have a voice to customer program, and traditional voice of customer programs tend to actually come out of customer service departments and customer experience departments, where they're looking at things like NPS score and their verbatims, looking at customer satisfaction scores, looking at their reviews. And this is a fairly standard thing. Actually, we do at MOO, we do every 3 months. Our great customer support team and CX team will come out and say, here's where customers are running into problems. So what we've started to look at is how do we do the voice of the non-customer program at the same time, right? And this is really trying to get at, hey, here's what the customers are saying, but here's all those people that never convert, here's what they're saying. Here's the top 5 things that are bothering them, the top 5 things you're not converting. And in some ways, just having that in a more prominent space has started to get the organization talking about it in a different way and starting to get some traction, right? So it ended up being, and we're still exploring this, we're just kicking it off, but it ended up being a small thing to do that actually puts it in the context of something people are really familiar with, to kind of get them talking in that way. And finally, I guess the easiest thing and flippant thing to say is, get out of the building. There's a classic quote that I've adapted here that one non-customer is 100% better than none. The first is just do it, right? I mean, qualitative feedback doesn't have to be hard. The amazing thing is there's way more non-customers in the world than there are customers, right? You probably have 95% of the people in this room are probably a non-customer of your product, right? Maybe they don't fit into that realm, but having the conversation, asking them who they use, what do they use, have they ever thought about this, it's really actually quite easy to find non-customers because they're all around us, right? And don't just leave talking to non-customers to your UX team or marketing team. Again, it's not, there's special ways of asking the right questions, but you can get lots of insights by just turning to the person next to you and asking them how they use your product, right? I mean, we'll come in tonight, ask many people that show up and say, I don't use business cards anymore. Great, tell me about that. What do you use, right? Do you use postcards? How do you use this in your business? It's a great taste of understanding. It's about observing them, right? And in getting at that, I want to touch a little bit on jobs to be done, because I think that anyone's familiar with this framework, it's looking at, hey, what is the job these non-customers are trying to solve? And that's key, because I think you see in the similar way, actually how we tend to organize our data and organize our companies don't tend to be based on jobs to be done. And there's lots of great documents and insights about how to implement jobs to be done and throw them through. But if we think about this from MOO, right, MOO very much has a product view in some ways of our world, right? There's business cards and identity collateral, and we have product marketing person that owns the business cards vertical, someone else owns the promotional cards vertical. But of course, this isn't how our customers think. There's then the demographic view, which is, hey, creative professionals, SMBs, enterprise, insert real estate or whatever vertical you have here. These tend to be marketing-based but highly addressable, right? Hey, they can go after hair salons because they can pull down that list and target them. But again, it's not necessarily how our people think. And so when we actually look and talk to people about, hey, what are you trying to do with a business card or a postcard or a flyer or a sticker? It comes to, I'm trying to acquire a lead, I'm trying to stand out, impress a potential client, look bigger than I am, or just survive my first year in business, right? And these are the outcomes that we really want to design around, right? They're really hard to measure, right? They're really hard to get in your data, and we never will get at that data. So it gets to that point of finding those balances, right, between those things. And it gets to me at this great quote by Brené Brown that says, stories are just data with soul. And I think as we approach customers and non-customers, this is what we're trying to get at, right? We need to find some quantitative data around non-customers that tends to cost a bit more, but also how do we balance that and where we get out there and start talking to people in a qualitative way to get to this. So kind of revisiting this story about Alexander Wald, it's actually hard to find any solid data on it. But it was, some people do say it was put into effect, it turned the tide of war, these patterns that he used were used onto the Korean and Vietnamese war, but it obviously saved many, many lives. And so, we don't know what we don't know, and that's okay, I think, for the most part. We're still really learning at MOO. Like, I can't say any of this is, hey, we've solved it all, but it's kind of a philosophical approach we're trying to get at. But I think we have to just admit we're often blind to why non-customers fail, right? Yet these breakthrough products come from understanding the potential customers who never show up in our dashboards or our metrics. So I want to close just with a quote from David McRaney, who says, we must remind ourselves that when you start to pick apart the winners from the losers, the successes and failures, the living and the dead, that by paying attention to one side of the equation, you are always neglecting the other. Cool. Thank you. So I guess we have, if anyone has any questions, do we record the questions too? No. You're supposed to save the hard ones for later, right?
I'll try the easy one. So, you know, taking MOO, any of the big businesses, when you look at the data, those millions of users, a sub-segment of those users represent exactly the behavior of the non-customers. So, you know, to improve anything, you have to measure it, and qualitative data is good to discover that a non-customer segment exists. And I had before an example of colorblinds.
Yeah.
For who some reason can't use the site. But some colorblind still call their friend and really need your service and therefore will use it, and you can measure it. Yeah. If you can identify this segment so that it doesn't show up as an aggregate percentage of all your users, do you know any tools that can add on to analytics programs that can measure, you know, dropout rates, any of those rates based on different user segments?
I don't, but a little bit how we've done this, so we've tried to enter, even with GA and like decibel insights, like you can identify micro conversions, right? So in some ways what we've tried to say is there is a big group of non-customers who come in and like sign up for a newsletter, right? Or for us, people, like a designer will come and download a PSD file or an InDesign file, right? Or sign up for a sample pack. And so some ways there's this in between, right? They haven't quite bought from us, but they are in our database, right? That have identified that. But the only other way to do it in mass amounts starts to get a little creepy, right? To try to get what data you're collecting and how you're reaching out to people. So the only way I've really seen success that people get at the site is some of those like Ethnio or usertesting.com, where you're trying to do interventions with people while they're actually on the site. Or you know, what we've also done is, again, it's pretty, like, for example, we have a lot of HR customers, right, that are coming and wanting to use our platform to manage their business identity. We'll go to HR conferences, right, and really just kind of, you know, there's the sales booth and then there's us, right, and all the people that come along that aren't our customers, right, will have, hey, you know, let us watch you use our site. Look at that. But those type of things are that. But again, that's really the balance, right? In some ways, it's hard to get, there's such a trust in quant data. A lot of this doesn't live in quant data, but again, it's finding that balance of how do we bring some of that qual in and have some wins, right? And then show, you know, and in some ways we say, look, if you have a big win, it'll eventually come out in conversion, right? And come out in orders, but it's tapping into that piece to kind of get those insights. And usually our insights are drawn by looking at the data we have. So it is this kind of loop, right? Of like, hey, we have an insight, let's try to implement it, and hopefully it then drives conversion, and then you kind of go back out, right? So one of the challenges researchers tend to have is you can go out and kind of live in this world, right, for a long time, and then come out with 100 things to do. And so I think it is, how do you go out and do non-customer research in an agile way, right? To get out, go talk to 20 people, come some ideas, come back and try to implement them and test and see if you get the big conversion wins or not. But
okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Those who base decisions on the KPIs will really hate this answer, though.
Yeah.
This approach.
Yeah.
But
that's the problem, right? I mean, that's why, you know, CEOs, you know, like data, right? And that's why we keep focusing on it. But I think the ones that get it realize, actually, if you want to do massive growth, right, as you get bigger and bigger, you get much more incremental, right? And this is that innovator's dilemma, right? Like, it's always easier to add one new product to grow versus looking over here that could be your entirely new business. And that's that constant challenge of innovation, I think, of taking the risk, I guess, for it. Yeah. Any other questions? Jokes? Mm-hmm.
How do you balance the speed versus quality sort of dilemma when maybe other business units are moving at a certain pace and the research is like, it'll come tomorrow sort of thing, and we haven't got the response rate or it's not quite right. How do you manage other stakeholders internally, and then how do you design for programs that you know is going to speed it up before we start?
Yeah, it's really, so how do you speed it up to get out there? And I think one, I mean, it's what's interesting even about qualitative research is there's really these two types, right? In some ways, the downside of UX, even in getting qualitative research into it's about optimization, right? So you're looking at little pieces of the funnel, and this is good because you say, hey, we did something, we got data, right? But then you're not doing that kind of more open-ended discussion, right? So what we do at MOO is some way very much we really kind of have the class like now and next, right? And our bets, right? So here's our 6 bets that's a now that says, hey, we really understand this problem, we know what the outcome's gonna be, and we feel pretty confident in it, right? But then we always try to say, look, there's next, right? And this may be 6 months from now, maybe 12 months from now, and that we need to help us make a decision. Those ones in next are still living in that realm, and so there's an expectation that a little more open-ended research is gonna happen on there. So it tends to be less of them, but we at least come down and say, look, we can't spend if you have $100 to spend, we can't spend it all on that final piece. But it takes some buy-in and enough resources to do that, right? If you don't have enough designers, enough researchers, then they're always going to be kind of at this end. So really, I think it's how do you do that balanced scorecard approach, to product management, and kind of say, look, even if it's one thing and one problem we're trying to solve that's most important to the business, usually, I think even executives reach out and say, look, we're trying to build a product strategy where we want to go a couple years from now, and we know it's this customer. Once you align on that, it tends to be, hey, we don't understand enough about that non-customer. Let's make sure we're doing research, and it needs to be about 6 months out, right, or even 3 months out, I think, to kind of get at the data you need, because even if you're buying non-customer panels and stuff, it's going to take a while to get that insight in. The challenge then, I think, is then how do you, what we do is identify what's some quick insights, right, so it doesn't take 6 months to get it. It's like, hey, here's what we're seeing, we're reporting on it, and hopefully it doesn't end out with here's the big research report. Hopefully it ends out with a design sprint, right, or something that's like, hey, we can take this in and a week later have some prototypes out. So I think sorry, I'm babbling a bit, but I think the thing to do is to try not to cut the research, but actually then accelerate the prototyping and iteration part, right? So what tends to happen is sometimes research gets squeezed into a minute, and then we'll spend 3 months kind of iterating and prototyping. One approach is to spend more time on research and then make sure you have design sprints and things set up that can take those ideas into prototypes and testing pretty quickly. And that once you start showing prototypes and showing people reacting to them, then all of a sudden the business gets bought in pretty quickly. If it's just living in a PowerPoint somewhere, it tends to get filed away behind the loud data, so to say. Yeah. Cool. Anybody else? No? Cool. Hey, thanks everybody. Yeah, it's fun to give this talk. It's a super fascinating area. Oh, yes, please.
Can you run us through how MOO structures their product engineering design? And you said research a lot. We don't use the word research much at TransferWise, so what are we missing out on?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, in some ways, MOO has about 10 a crew, we call them crews, right? About 4 or more back-endy, 5 or 6 to 6 are more kind of customer-facing, right? And one of the things one of our big changes has been we basically talk about quads actually. So we have each crew then has of course a product manager, a engineering lead, a user experience designer, and an agile delivery coach, right? And we've kind of invested in making sure those are staffed properly. And so each team tends to have a UX designer, but then what we've also done is we have 3 researchers, but we have 3 customer segments. And so what we've tried to say is how do we organize around the customer more? So actually the big changes we actually have a VP of customer. So for example, there's a VP of Pro, and along with that team, there's a researcher that's focused on pros, right? There's a product manager that's supposed to kind of understand what pros need, right? And that's kind of been a shift. And the challenge there, right, is that VP Pro isn't like, hey, it's only a product role. They have product and sales and services, right? Because the customer journey goes across all these different touch points. So that's been one key thing. In general, I think MOO's lucky because also MOO's always recognize that design is super important to us. And in the end of the day, you know what? It's 2-sided pieces of printed paper, right? Like, I mean, it's from a differentiation strategy, a lot comes down to software and ease of use and the quality of our product. And therefore design's been important. But we have 3 researchers, and they kind of split their time between teaching the other designers how to fish, like how to use usertesting.com, right? Or teaching the product managers how to fish, and then they hopefully can spend the other chunk of their time doing kind of bigger, broader pieces. But they are shared across kind of those 6 teams. And it hasn't even been easy getting to 3, UX design. This time is there 3 researchers. It's been over the course of 2 or 3 years to kind of build it up. But also, a lot of this stuff is just kind of going out and doing it. You know, even for product managers, I think that as I've found, even if you get bigger and bigger, even I spend less time talking to customers, right? Because there's more time in meetings and Excel spreadsheets and these kind of stuff, and getting the time to go out to talk with people is hard. So in some ways, it's just making the time to do that and taking a video every now and then, and that helps a lot. But also the biggest thing we've done recently is really just try to focus on a couple customer segments and say, this is the most important one. We understand we don't understand, so how do we get deeper understanding? And even one researcher then can go a long way till doing that, even if it's just one team can kind of help. Yeah. Yes? Like the templates that go on the business cards, or the design of the process?
Yeah, as in, I don't know, maybe organize focus groups or maybe online focus groups.
Yeah.
Maybe test some designs before you put them into production.
Yeah. Yeah, we do somewhat. So I think what's interesting is one, we have thousands of templates. So actually we have some pretty good data to say here are high converting templates, right? And the high converting templates tend to be the simplest ones, right? But then on the other side, what's really interesting is you have something that our product marketing, Elena, calls pink bras. Yeah. Anyway, it's the thing that's in the window that actually no one buys, but gets people to come in. Right, so meaning we actually have templates that kind of are more about PR and getting it out and people talking about it, right? And even though when people come in, it gets them to the site, but then they end up using the more simple one. But to that end, we do try to view templates as an interface element, right? Meaning once you get it into our creation tool, it's just another UI element, right? So in some ways, we don't test all the templates go out, but it's one where actually data-driven works pretty well, because you put them up there and quite quickly you see the ones that are being used and which are not. And a lot of our templates are used also for SEO long tail things to try to get searches and things like that. We don't do enough testing of our templates, but at this point we kind of know the ones that work kind of well for people, and it tends to be simpler than better. Yeah. Cool. All right, thanks everybody, appreciate it.
Thanks. Okay, thank you, Chad. That was really interesting. So now it's time for shout-outs. For those of you who have been here before, they probably know how it works. So everybody who is working on something interesting, who is building a product, who wants to gather user feedback, or usually just wants to share something, feel free to come up now. Do we have anyone? Absolutely no one? Come up here.
Can I load a website?
Well, if you want, yeah.
Is this your laptop?
I trust you. I trust you.
Okay. There's a bit of a lag here. I just released a product 2 weeks ago called Synced. I don't know how many of you guys listen to podcasts. Many podcast listeners? Okay, so I've been a podcast listener for like 10 years or something now, and often I'll want to share something with my wife or a friend or something, but I don't want to send them the whole hour of audio, because how can I expect them to listen to it when I just want them to listen to 15 seconds of something that I thought they would like? That, or I'll listen to something and then 5 years later, I want to listen to that same 30-second audio clip again, but I can't find it. So I built a product that takes the transcript of podcasts and links it to the audio so that I could put a search engine in front, and you can search the transcripts and then jump directly into the actual audio to listen. So it's kind of hard to picture because I haven't seen anything like this before, so that's why I put up the website so you guys can actually see what I'm talking about here. So if I play the episode.
Hey, this is Craig Cannon, and you're listening to Y Combinator's podcast. Today's episode is with Jessica.
There's a lag, so picture it's matching exactly, but it doesn't exactly work with the AV here. Yeah. So if I adjust this timeline down here, you can see that like the transcript will actually, it should follow it down the page. Okay. Okay. Well, if it's interesting to you, then if you go to the webpage, then you could try it out and see it actually working and everything. So yeah, that's it. Does anyone have any questions or opinion or anything?
Yeah, I absolutely love it. Mostly because I think so much niche podcasts are like filled with a whole bunch of filler, and you've got to really put up with the amount of filler to get like decent stuff.
Yeah.
How, if I was listening to like an SEO podcast, for example, and I hit like the meat of the matter that I wanted to share, how would I do that with Syncs? Like, what's the flow for me to like take the bit that I've just listened to and loved, and
Yeah.
save or share?
So the idea is kind of to be like the medium of podcasts. So that feature I haven't put on the live site yet, but soon it'll be up there where you can just select text, and then a little share tooltip will come. You can click that, and then you'll get a short link that you can put to Twitter or to email or whatever. And then when someone opens the share link, it'll actually go to that block and then start there. Yeah.
So as it requires the transcript.
Absolutely, yeah.
You the transcript when you analyze the text and just produce the transcript.
So right now I'm not providing transcripts. So I'm trying to bootstrap this myself, and so I have to pick and choose carefully what to actually work on. And so I'm targeting, transcripts are really expensive to produce. So if you're putting out like 4 episodes a month, you're gonna be spending $300 on just transcripts. So I'm kind of betting on, if someone's spending $300 on transcripts, they'll probably like to spend some incremental amount to better leverage those for the customers. So that's why I'm targeting people that already have transcripts to start with.
Do you already have podcasts in mind to partner with or partnerships that you're working on?
Yeah, so I just started selling it 2 weeks ago, and I have one taker so far. It's not live yet, so I have one, yeah. Yeah.
Which podcast is it?
I shouldn't say because I don't want to jinx it, but but it's, yeah. Yeah, no, it's a done deal. I just gotta get it out there, but yeah. I'll put the logo up once it's live.
Just a wild idea. Been in sales for a long time. It's tough work. But me as a user, I'd love to use it. Actually, I might consider paying for this.
Interesting.
And the market of users is so much bigger than the market of podcast owners.
That's a great point, yeah. Okay, thanks. I'll think about that.
Sorry, I think it's really interesting. What kind of users are you targeting, except of course listeners of podcasts? Is it any more specific than that? Do you have a certain customer in mind?
Well, as podcasts go, there's like kind of a few different genres. There's like the Joe Rogans, or that's like a Howard Stern style show that's 3 or 4 hours a day. People are really not going back to that kind of content. There's another type that's really information dense, where you're listening kind of for your work. Maybe you're a software developer or a product manager or marketer, and you're kind of getting these insights that you definitely want to use them in your work, but you're not hearing them at the time that you need. So I'm kind of trying to target those types of shows that are information dense that you actually will need to retrieve the segments later. Yeah. Okay, thanks guys. Oh. Yeah, it works on mobile too. So on desktop, like, you can actually use the arrow keys and scroll to navigate to fast forward and reverse. On mobile, it's kind of cool if you try it. You can swipe to actually fast forward and reverse. Yeah. Okay, thanks guys.
Thanks. Okay, anyone else? Come on up.
Thank you. Yeah, I will try. I don't really like mics, but okay. So my name is Ola, and I represent a company called GoGo Apps. We are a design and software house. We deliver product development on outsourcing basis. We've got very UX, UI-oriented approach. So basically, if you guys have got any needs, need any support for yourself or your team, feel free to grab me afterward, and I am happy to share with you my beautiful MOO printed business cards. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, anyone else who would like to come forward? No founders in the room? How many founders do we have in the room? Raise your hand. Just one. Two. No one else? Okay, then that is it, I think. I'll close the stage, and right now there's time for networking. There's still some beer left and some wine, I think. We close at, the end time is 9, so just hang around, get to know each other. And this is the last Products That Count event of this year. So we will be continuing this series at the start of next year, probably around February. You should be signed up to the email list. So I want to thank you all for coming, and see you next time in the new year.